This is episode 12 of the I Used to Think podcast. My name is Pat, and this is the podcast about the stories of people who are brave enough to change their mind. Today's interview guest is Gabby. Gabby graduated law school in Orange County, California, and started her career working as an asylum officer for the Department of Homeland Security. She has since transitioned to the role of refugee officer and has traveled to various countries interviewing refugees who are seeking asylum in the United States. Gabby's decision to work with refugees and to work within the immigration system was heavily influenced by her own experience growing up, moving from country to country. I don't want to spoil too much of the episode, so let's get started. All right, we can start with the icebreaker. And I actually have two today because I was just talking to my sister and we were brainstorming and she threw out a really good one.
Oh.
So I'll ask two. One is more like a practical one and one is more of like a funny one. So since you are so well traveled, both professionally and for personal reasons, is there a favorite travel hack that you have that many people might not know that makes traveling easier and makes things better for you?
Okay, I have to think about it. A favorite travel hack. Power chargers are very important. Even if you're traveling to a major city with all the amenities. Well, my iPhone dies very fast. So it's very helpful. So I think the one thing that I have to have when I travel is my travel power chargers.
Do you have multiple for a trip?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
I have one that I keep in my check-in bag, one for my backpack, and then one for like my purse. Actually, I think every bag has one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just always somewhere in your reach, you have a power charger. Okay. The funnier icebreaker that my sister came up with is after you travel and you come back to the United States, is there a food that you crave that you can only find in the United States that when you come back you just have to have?
Something that I crave that I have to have that's only available in the US.
Yes, or maybe better in the US.
Probably tacos. I wouldn't say I crave it when I get back, but it's the one thing that isn't really, well, if it is available in another country, it's not as good as the tacos that we have here in California.
Okay.
And I'm from San Diego, so we take Mexican food very seriously.
Right.
So it would probably be that.
Okay. Would the exception be if you were coming back from Mexico? Or even then, they're still better?
That's a great question. I've only been to Mexico one time. I feel like it was pretty similar to the Mexican food in San Diego. So
wow.
I guess in that respect, I didn't spend a lot of time in Mexico. It was just for a few days. So yeah, maybe. I don't know, actually. I'd have to go back to Mexico and reassess, like, how is Mexican food here in Mexico?
Go and bring back a taco. Yeah. Try to preserve the flavor as much as you can and then compare it to San Diego.
Yes.
Okay. I didn't expect that. I know for me, I was in Taiwan last year and I was in Asia in 2018. So I've done my fair share of traveling, but both times coming back, I went straight to In-N-Out.
Oh, that's a good one.
And even my relatives overseas, when they come to the United States, will ask to stop at In-N-Out first. Which is not only unique to the United States, but the West Coast, I believe.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Arizona, California, yeah. But tacos, I like that answer. I'll give a little bit of an intro to how I know Gabby. Gabby and I met at a community group, which is a small group hosted by, well, at this point, people from various churches. So Gabby and I go to separate churches, and it's cool. I like how, like, within our group, people kind of attend different churches and come together. But I met Gabby and her husband Josh maybe a year ago or longer.
Yeah, I think it was last year.
Okay.
When the leaders of our small group had two separate small groups.
Right.
And you were in the other one. And then eventually, sometime last year, they merged the two groups.
Right. Well, to me, you were in the other one. But I get what you're saying. Yes, so the merging of our small groups also merged many relationships. And yeah, I've enjoyed getting to know you and Josh better over this past year. I don't think I've told you this, but I really wanted to invite you to be on an episode. Is you've dropped kind of nuggets here and there of your work and the things you've experienced and seen. It's like a teaser every time. You're like, yeah, I was just in this other country working with refugees. And how was your weekend? Stuff like that I always latch onto and think like, okay, they need to eventually be on a podcast episode. On top of that, yeah, I mean, you're just a very like open, I feel like vulnerable person. And that's something that I look for and appreciate in my podcast guests. And with that being said, what is your I used to think statement?
So I used to think that immigration was not a Christian issue, but now I believe that it is.
So that's a big one, and I'm very excited to unpack this. Let's start with, what is your job and what do you do?
I'm a refugee officer. I work for the federal government, specifically the Department of Homeland Security. And essentially what I do is I travel the world and I interview refugees and adjudicate their refugee claims and decide whether they should be resettled into the U.S. or not.
How did you get started in this field?
So after law school, I started working as an asylum officer, which is essentially the same job. The main difference is that asylum officers adjudicate refugee claims domestically here in the U.S. because the person seeking asylum is already in the U.S.
Okay. And the person seeking asylum is in the U.S. through like a refugee program that's already been established?
No.
Okay.
So the applicants who are already in the U.S. enter the U.S. through various means, primarily as a tourist.
Oh.
So they apply for a tourist visa, they get approved, they travel to the US. Either they already know the system and submit an application, or they meet with an attorney that represents them throughout the process. And then they'll have an interview with an asylum officer. And then from there, the asylum officer decides if this person meets the definition of a refugee, in which case, if they do, then they will get asylum. And if not, then they are allowed to stay in the U.S. until the duration of their tourist visa ends.
Okay. So you were conducting those asylum interviews?
Yes.
How did that feel? I mean, when you started doing that?
Sure. I thought it was very rewarding. For the most part, it was very rewarding. This was my first exposure to, but not all of it was great, as you can imagine. It was challenging because you want to help them. You hear about the worst things that happen to them. And asylum is only granted for very specific reasons. It's not enough that you were persecuted in the past.
Okay.
Or you will face future persecution. The motivation behind the persecution has to be one of the 5 enumerated reasons in the statute. And so I came across situations where a person was harmed, severely harmed in the past, but then it didn't fit under one of the 5 main reasons. And so I couldn't necessarily help some people, and that for me was hard.
Right. So this is something we didn't actually get to discuss when we were just talking on the phone earlier, prepping for this interview. I was curious, so based on what I know, you're from the Philippines?
Yes.
And born and raised in the Philippines?
I lived in the Philippines, but I was actually born in Ogden, Utah.
Okay. I didn't know that.
I was born there, but then we moved to Australia. My dad's parents are in Australia.
Mm-hmm.
I lived there till I was 5,
Okay.
and then we moved back to the Philippines. That's where my parents are from, and lived there for 6 years. And then when I was 12 years old, we moved back to the U.S., and I've lived here ever since.
Okay, so you grew up, would you say you grew up in Australia, Philippines, or probably both?
Both, yeah.
Okay. And my guess is that experience has influenced your career so far?
100%, yeah.
Okay. I guess that would be my question. How is that your journey? I guess, would you consider yourself an expat or in those countries? How has that influenced your career?
Yeah. So even though I was born here in the US, I feel very much like an immigrant. I think my experience as an immigrant made me into this person that I am. I have a lot of compassion for refugees and immigrants. I think that God gave me those experiences for this specific purpose. What I do now, I think this is my calling. So, yeah, that's how it influenced me and what I do today.
Was it difficult to go through that experience, like moving from country to country, even though you didn't specifically move to gain refugee status or anything of that sort? Did you find that experience was hard, or?
Sure.
Yeah, how would you describe that?
So it was hard. My family didn't immigrate all together at the same time. And actually, this is very common for immigrant families. Usually the parents or parent, in my case, it was just my mom, would go first. So she came to the US. And then a few years later, I came once it was financially feasible for her to bring me.
Right.
But my 2 siblings, they were not born here. And so it took even longer to bring them to the US. And so it was really hard. And also just coming as a kid, dealing with, school and wanting to fit in and being othered by other kids too. There was that as well.
Right.
It was really hard. But as an adult, I can now say that was a blessing. But it was hard.
Yeah. Did you move to California?
Yes.
Okay. And did you find that you were able to interact with other people with similar backgrounds in California?
That's a great question. My first school here in the US was actually predominantly Filipino.
Okay.
In San Diego, and I could not make friends with my own people. They were the ones that bullied me, actually. So yeah, my first set of friends were like Mexicans, African Americans. The one white girl at my school, she became my friend. Not every Filipino was mean, but
Right.
I don't know why that is, but they make fun of your accent like that. Yeah, that was not cool.
That is surprising.
Yeah.
There's probably a plethora of reasons why. But was that one of the reasons your family moved to that area? Was because of that school? Or at least the community was mostly Filipino?
So my mom had relatives in the specific neighborhood that we ended up living in. I think that was the main reason why I ended up in that public school. However, I only stayed in that school for 1 year because considering how the local schools in that area were performing, I qualified to go to a better school like 45 minutes away.
Okay.
And then the new school was more diverse and it was a better experience.
Yeah, I asked those questions about your upbringing just because I kind of assumed that there was a connection there. And I've come to learn that often what we become passionate about are things that resonate with us because they impacted us some way when we were growing up or our community. And just to even give a little bit of like how I resonate with that, my mom was an immigrant from Taiwan, immigrated in the 80s, and she didn't have a family yet, but the whole idea of coming over just by yourself and just kind of like scoping things out. And she also had a friend in California who she was able to rent a room from. I find that it has changed my perspective and experience of the world compared to kids whose parents grew up here in the United States. I was actually just talking to my friend Jordan, and he was saying that I think he was reading a book saying that a lot of kids who have immigrant parents feel the pressure to, I guess, not take anything for granted. I know my mom worked very hard to be where she's at now and to own a home in the United States and to raise a family in the United States. And there is that unspoken pressure, I feel like, that I feel that when I talk to my friends who have been here for multiple generations, they can't fully relate to. And it's something I've just been aware of more and more of like, why am I so big on saving money? Like, why am I so thrifty or frugal? Or just little things like little behaviors like that that I find are influenced by having an immigrant parent. But I guess going along to your statement now, well, first of all, so you just got back from 2 trips from your job. So talk about that transition from we were at asylum officer to eventually refugee officer, and how that transition has been almost like going into this new more intense job.
Sure. So I think initially I was just thinking that it's the same job. I'm doing the same thing, and what I didn't realize is the ways in which they are very different. So first, in asylum, almost always the applicant has an attorney. These are people who have the means to purchase a plane ticket and hire an attorney. And obviously, if you have an attorney, they can coach you. I don't like the word coach, but they can strategize with you how to best present your claim.
Okay.
And so in that sense, they know exactly what to say during the interview.
Right.
However, in refugee, the refugees abroad, they cannot apply for refugee status. They have to be admitted into the program called the US Rep, and they're processed by the UN. And it's the UN that determines whether they should have an interview with one of the countries that are accepting refugees.
Okay.
And since they don't have that representation, the interviews are very different. The refugee interviews are very different than asylum interviews. It's more raw. They haven't turned over a new leaf. All they know is this really horrible thing happened in the past, and my life is still in limbo, and I don't know what's going to happen next. So that was probably the biggest difference. What else? I think also just being abroad makes me feel like I am closer to the darkness. Like I am in the front lines.
Right.
Like in battle or war, like all the soldiers are important, even the ones who are not in the front lines, like they're all important. And the way I see it, asylum officers are those soldiers that are kind of like in a safer place, whereas refugee officers are the ones like in the front lines.
Almost doing the dirty work.
Yeah.
Putting their hands actually in the field.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know there are things that you might not be allowed to talk about, so share what you can. But this question came to my mind as far as the asylum seekers. Do they tend to be wealthier then, since they're already in the country?
Yes.
Okay, so that does play a fact. That is play a role.
Yes. The refugees that I interview abroad live in refugee camps. They're usually not able to work in the country of asylum because that country, for whatever reason, doesn't want to or just refuses to give them the same rights as their normal citizens. So, for example, I was in Turkey, and the Syrian refugees were not allowed to leave the camp unless they got specific permission. And if they had to leave the camp for something really important like the refugee interview, and they didn't get that permission, if they were to get caught and this has happened, they get deported. Even though there's a perfectly justifiable reason for why they violated that ordinance of not leaving the camp.
Is that to protect somebody, or what is that purpose of that?
I really don't know, but if I were to guess, I think it's the country's attempt to have control, because there's a lot of refugees
Right.
that have come in to Turkey. And so you got to have some form of control over that. And the way I see it, that's what they're doing.
Right. I'll try to give some background and you can fill in the holes of the whole refugee crisis. I looked up specifically the Syrian refugee crisis, which, if I'm being honest, I wasn't too familiar with. I just knew I would see pictures of it throughout the past 10 years. I would maybe see videos on social media. So I did a little bit more digging, and it sounds like the crisis started in 2011.
Yep.
So it's been over a decade now. And it had to do with various protests, including, I guess, pro-democracy protests.
Yes. So actually, it started with the Arab Spring.
Okay.
So there were other Arab countries in the region that started revolting against their governments because they wanted a democracy.
Okay.
And so Syrians saw this happening all around them. And some kids in a place called Dara, Daraa,
Okay.
in Syria, had written, like in a public space on a wall, "Doctor, you are next."
Okay.
So their current president, I don't know if that's his title, but the person in charge,
Right.
he's a doctor also. Like he went to medical school or something. So it was kind of apparent like who these kids were referring to when you think about the context, like what's happening in the region. So they did that, and then some, I think, police officers arrested these kids. They were children, and tortured them.
So young, like, do you know the ages?
So I'm not 100% sure, but
Okay.
I think like around 14,
Okay.
12 to 14.
Yeah.
And so they were arrested, tortured, and then people started protesting because of how the government treated these children. And then the protest movement got bigger and bigger and bigger. And it just got out of hand. The government started responding in a violent manner, and the protesters in response formed groups and, also became violent, and it became a war. And sadly, there's no more Syria. I mean, the country's still there, but...
Right. I saw a statistic that around 70% of the country is essentially in poverty. And that here it says well, this article came out in 2017, but 58% of children in August of 2017 or of the refugees were children. So is it still the case that most of those refugees are kids as of right now?
So it takes a long time to have your refugee interview.
Mm-hmm.
And so by the time I see them, some time has passed.
Oh,
a lot
true.
of them entered Turkey as children. But by the time I meet them, most of them are like in their 20s and 30s. They have their kids. But yes, that is true. I would say I interviewed younger individuals. There were some older folks as well, but a lot of them were in their 20s, 30s. Yeah.
Right. When you do these interviews, are you actually in the camp?
No.
Okay.
We're in a regular office building.
Okay. I was curious if you firsthand have witnessed the conditions of the camp.
So I've only gone on 2 trips with this job, but I do know that in other locations, in some parts of Africa, they do conduct the interview like at the camp.
Wow.
So I haven't done it, but we also do that in other places.
Okay, I guess now kind of catching up to present day, you just got back from Turkey and you were in Jordan last winter?
Yes. So I went like end of January, I think.
Okay.
And I was there for 5 weeks.
Okay, so both trips were this year?
Yes.
Okay, and I point that out just to say these are very fresh in your mind.
Yes.
And I'm sure, as you mentioned to me already, heavy, and you still feel, I guess, the emotions of it. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. Like, what are some of your takeaways now from those 2 trips?
So the first thing that comes to mind is like something that I didn't anticipate. I didn't anticipate that I would feel sad leaving these countries. I think the main reason is because when I go to another country, it feels like my life changes in an instant and I have an entirely new routine. I meet new people. I just immerse myself in the whole experience and it feels like this is my life now.
Right.
And then before you know it, you're back in the US, and it's hard because due to the nature of the job, you hear about really bad things every day. And you kind of get desensitized to it, but then you realize when you go back to the US, okay, these people in America have no idea how good we have it. And it's hard to just not think about it.
Right.
All the stories that I heard, all the people that I met, their realities, the things that they had gone through. When you juxtapose that to the reality that we have here in the US, it's hard to just live normal and be normal. So that was surprising to me.
I remember in our initial phone call when you were saying that most of the time when you're working domestically, it's work from home. And I thought about that more after our call, and I thought, I can't imagine the shock that comes when you've spent months working at your desk in your sweatpants and then for another month of your job, you're in another country interviewing desperate people, hurting people every single day. I mean, that's like...
It's so different.
It's a big change.
And you have to represent the United States. You have to, be this professional.
Right.
It's so different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned before that your work purposely gives you time off after trips, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's... Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad you get that.
Thank you.
That's all I
am grateful.
Right. Are there... Actually, I'll bring this up. And this is where some of my experience comes in. But, when you first brought up this topic, I thought of all the misconceptions that I had, that my peers had, of refugees and of even the crisis in general. And so sure enough, when I was looking stuff on the internet, trying to find the most unbiased sources I could, I found this quote. I believe someone who works in the UN saying that a lot of the misconceptions are that these refugees are dangerous, that they're criminals, that they're threats to national security, that they, even if they might have good intentions, will only hurt themselves because of how hard it is to assimilate into a different culture, whether it's Germany or the United States. Just the culture shock of it will not benefit them. And so those are things that I've heard. Like, I grew up in a community, specifically my church community, that I heard a lot of these narratives. There is also, I believe ISIS is, the creation of ISIS is attributed to Arab Springs. Is that correct? Or not directly?
ISIS, I mean, I have heard that, so ISIS is a group that was born out of another group that was born out of another group.
Okay.
And so I don't know if the Arab Spring started it all, but I am willing to bet that it's been at least the ideas that they believe in have been around longer than even before the Arab Spring.
Okay.
Muslim extremists have been around longer than that.
Right. That makes sense. And because of I think the fear that I felt from some people when ISIS was at, I guess, full capacity or whatever you want to call it, a lot of that was mixed into the narrative with the refugees being dispersed all over the world. What are your thoughts on these?
Sure.
Are they true? Are they not? What, as Americans, should we know based on what you've experienced?
Well, based on personal experience, I would say Islamophobia became a thing starting in 2001 with the Taliban. We saw how, because of this one thing that happened, all Muslims all of a sudden became a terrorist.
Right.
Does that answer the question?
I'll rephrase it and see if it helps. I guess, what's true and what's not of that list?
Oh, what's true and what's not.
And as someone with your experience, what do you really want, I guess, Americans to know?
Okay.
About those people?
I think it's to have any type of fear relating to strangers is natural. And as with anything, that fear can evolve into something much bigger than it actually is. So I think it's true that it's natural to have fear, but I think that fear can sometimes cloud us from the truth. Obviously, I don't believe that all Muslims are terrorists, and they are. So I'm speaking from experience. I've met a lot of Muslims now. They're very, very nice people. They're big on gift giving. So you can never, it's a saying, you can never outgive a Muslim person. If you give them something, they will give you something back, and usually it's like a better gift.
Okay.
And they will expect that you gift back. And it's a never ending cycle. You just keep on giving. And so it's funny because we were advised before going to Jordan and Turkey to wait till the very end if we wanted to like give a gift.
Okay.
To wait till the very end of the trip to avoid that whole situation where you're gonna have to keep on giving so you don't insult them inadvertently for not knowing that you're supposed to give them back another gift. So they're very generous. They're very loving and kind people. So that's been my experience with Muslims.
Right. To the extent that you're allowed to disclose, what were some of your What were some of your interactions like? Did they seem... Well, I'm sure it's obviously terrified to some extent getting interviewed.
So the interviews with the refugees, our interactions are very limited to just the interview.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't even call it like a real, yes, it's a human interaction, but we can't really deviate too far from what I have to, ask you. We have time constraints.
Right.
But I got to know the interpreters really, really well.
Okay.
Because we tend to work with the same interpreters. The people that work at the hotels where we stay.
Okay.
We also really get to know them really well because we're there for, 6 to 8 weeks at a time. And you see them all the time. Breakfast, when they greet you, when you get back from work.
Yeah.
So those were the interactions that I had with people from these Muslim countries. And I'll just give a few examples. The interpreters, so sometimes, like, we talk so much in the interview that, like, I'll lose my voice.
Mm.
And they'll make you some tea, like, after the interview. And they don't have to do that, but it happened a couple of times, and it's just so sweet and so nice. Like, we also have interpreters, by the way, for asylum officers.
Okay.
And I never got that experience from the interpreters here in the U.S. So I don't know what it is, but they're just very, very loving.
Mm.
Yeah.
And these are interpreters that are from Turkey?
Some of them. So they're also from other countries as well.
Okay.
Some are Syrians, some are Jordanians.
Mm-hmm.
Generally from that region. Egyptians.
Yeah. You mentioned before that coming back to the U.S. is always jarring. And one of the things being the stark contrast between the quality of life there and here. What are some other things that were difficult to adjust to coming back?
I think just reconnecting with friends and family was also difficult. So when we're abroad, we're very, very busy.
Right.
So yes, I do keep in touch with my friends and my family, but major life events happen over the course of 6 to 8 weeks.
Yeah.
And so when I get back to the US, it's kind of difficult to just like get back into how it was with your friends.
Yeah.
It's not natural. And I guess that's what happens when, a significant period of time passes. But also, again, just like the work itself affects that. Just because something has happened that has affected me, I can't really talk about it. But, I still have to live my life and be there for my friends and my family. And you just deal. And I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like an undercurrent.
Right.
A burden.
Something that's always... I like the word undercurrent. Something that's always stewing.
You can't really see it. It's just...
Right.
It's powerful.
This pales in comparison to your experience, but when I come back overseas, and the longest I've been overseas is probably 4 weeks, 5 weeks, I think something that's unique to American culture is just the stimuli that is everywhere here. I mean, I remember coming back from Taiwan last year and driving down the freeway, there were billboards every 5 seconds on the freeway. And I just thought, wow, that's really extra. And I can relate also, to coming back and wanting to tell people about your experience and not finding the words for it. And it does really become an undercurrent. It becomes a part of me that is part of my memory and part of my experiences now. Mm-hmm. And can only be shared really through story and I guess photos
Yeah.
and videos,
Yeah.
but it still isn't sufficient.
Yeah. And then the thing too is they want to know about the other things, like, oh, like what fun things did you do? What great food did you eat? And what did you see? And all that. Like the fun things. And maybe this is just me, but it kind of makes me feel like this person just has no idea, like, what the whole point is. Like, yes, that's part of it, but I guess we can talk about that. But yeah, I don't know, but that part has been difficult, like talking about my work, but they only want to talk about the fun things.
Yeah. Right. And that makes sense to me because your purpose was for work.
Yeah.
Yeah. I hope this is a chance for you to be able to not talk about anything fun.
I'm actually enjoying this so much, and I want to say thank you for giving me this space to talk about this. And as you know, it's hard to talk about, but
yeah.
it's healing for me. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. So I feel like we've essentially done a ton of setup for your statement, which I felt was necessary because not everybody knows the details of the Syrian refugee crisis or what an asylum officer does. Your statement, though, is truly what interests me because we both have Christian heritage and we both have Christian values. And in reference to what I said earlier about all those narratives I heard around refugees being dangerous and things like that, I actually heard from the church. And so I think this is very important to talk about. What was your journey like once you started realizing, okay, immigration is a Christian issue as opposed to what is stated in this article that you sent me by the Washington Post, in which Franklin Graham was quoted saying that immigration is not a Bible issue. To you, why is that not the case?
Sure. So, as I said, I started my career as an asylum officer. I went to law school, and so we were trained on the relevant immigration laws. And so it makes sense to me that a nation cannot admit anyone and everyone. And so I guess just from a legal perspective, I was comfortable with the idea that we should refuse certain individuals.
Okay.
And I guess just doing the job and being someone who's like on the inside, I also witnessed how people could take advantage of the U.S. immigration system, and that was very disheartening. I'm an immigrant myself, and so to see that that is happening just did not make me feel good. And so that was how I used to think. But then last year, when I started my new position as a refugee officer, I thought that I finally achieved my dream job, and I was so excited but also fearful that I would like just think that, oh, I did this is for my glory. And out of that fear, I became very intentional about remembering that it's not for my glory, like it's for God's glory. He gave me this job. And I'm just the vessel, and I need to do something to keep myself in check. And so God's been telling me to read the Bible like for 5 years, and I tried different ways to read the Bible, like going and reading like Bible studies and different reading plans, and that worked for a while, but I realized it's not really working. I just need to just read it like a book from beginning to end. And it was a great time to do that last year when I finally got this job. So I bought myself a Bible and I just started reading it. And then the things that stood out to me were verses about refugees because I'm a refugee officer, duh.
Right.
And so it was very novel, like the Bible talking about refugees. I had never really heard a sermon about immigration. It spoke to me. But then these verses that talked about refugees were contradictory to how I used to think.
Mm-hmm.
Because it talks about God's love and how his love is radical and it doesn't make sense. The Bible says, love your neighbor. That's the golden rule.
Mm-hmm.
But who is your neighbor?
Oh, man,
right?
This is good.
And I guess in the past, I just assumed that it was talking about other Israelites.
Okay.
Because who were they preaching to? It was the Israelites. And what were the Israelites doing to the other nations? They were just conquering them and killing all of them. So it didn't occur to me that your neighbor could be the stranger, the sojourner, the refugee.
Right.
And so it really challenged me to think about who is a refugee. So in the past, with my, legal mind, I just believed that the refugee is those people who fit that criteria based on the statute. Those are the people that deserve to be admitted. But obviously, those are not the only reasons why people immigrate to the U.S. And so I used to think one way, but I also believe that the Bible is right. And so now I believe that immigration is a Christian issue. I'm still struggling with this idea, actually. But I'm open to my paradigm being changed the more I read the Bible.
Does this apply to, practically speaking, whether your opinion on whether there should be limits on what qualifies as a refugee?
So we don't have discretion when I'm adjudicating cases. I'm actually grateful that, we don't, because then if it were up to me, I would do things differently. But
right.
It's very important too that for the job, to keep that separate, my beliefs, but also I have to do my job well. Right. And that means you have to make decisions based on the law.
Right.
And I don't know how to reconcile those two things. I really don't.
Yeah.
It's a struggle.
That's hard.
I think I comfort myself by reminding myself that God is still in control. So yes, when I have to decide whether this refugee should be admitted into the U.S., it's based on their testimony and whether or not I can admit them based on U.S. laws.
Mm-hmm. There was a verse earlier, I think, that you mentioned that summarized well God's view of refugees and sojourners. Do you have that pulled up?
So, yes, it's Leviticus 19, verse 9. And this section is the part that gives examples on what it means to love your neighbor. So there's a number of examples, actually, but it was very striking to me that the first example was about refugees. The specific word that this verse uses is sojourner, but that's essentially what a refugee is. Mm-hmm. So it says here, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. So basically, God is saying, when it's harvest time, don't harvest all the crops. Leave some for the poor and the sojourner or the refugee. So that's one way to explain what it means to love your neighbor. And this was when I realized neighbor is not just your fellow Christians or just the Israelites. Right. It's also the strangers, the people who are not from your land.
I like that you brought up the tension between those verses and the fact that all throughout the history of Israel, they were commanded by God to completely wipe out nations.
Yes.
And it's one of those things where as a Christian, I say I don't completely understand. And I would think that you're in the same boat.
Yes.
The other thing I will add, though, and I like how you said that God's attitude towards the sojourners was one of the first things he mentions when it came to collecting your harvest. I've heard it worded as, this is probably a Tim Keller sermon, so I'll attribute it to him, but I don't really know. I've heard if God had a business card and it said, God and all his credentials, the first thing that would be on his business card would be father to the fatherless, protector of the sojourners, and provider for the poor.
Yes.
As opposed to creator, which I believe he also is, as opposed to like whatever you want to call it, like Lord of the Universe. I mean, he has there's so many things God could refer to him as. I mean, he could even call himself like the almighty king, super powerful guy. Or whatever, and he would have every right to do so. The God. Yes, the guy. And I mean, in other parts of Scripture, he refers to himself as I am, and things that imply greatness. But I do believe, if we do read the Bible, cover to cover, you'll see that his business card really does say Father to the fatherless and God of the sojourner. Gosh, I could talk about this.
It's powerful.
It really is. And I'll add to that the fact that I mentioned to you that I volunteer as best as I can at a camp every year for youth in foster care. And I find that there's always a point during the week. So I actually just got back a couple weeks ago. But there's always a point during the week where I just want to give up. And it's usually like Wednesday or Thursday of the 5 days that I'm there. And almost every year, I remind myself, what better things do I have to do right now? Obviously if some family emergency came up or something happened to my wife, I'd drop everything and go. But to be reminded of what the priorities are based on what God's priorities are, I feel like really helps me.
Can I ask you, what is the thing or things that makes you want to give up?
Lack of sleep.
For
one. It's physically demanding. It's probably the hardest week of the year every year for me. And also, I'd be curious if you relate to this, but the doubt of, is anything changing? Am I changing anything? I don't even have complete jurisdiction over these kids. I don't have any, really. They belong to the state.
Yeah.
When they're in foster care, in the same way that you have no control over the refugees' lives. Sure. And so the thought, I think, really, it's very intrusive of, this is only a week with the kids. Most of the day looks like eating lunch with them, playing basketball, and playing with Legos. How much of an impact is that really making? And one of my friends said recently, and I don't think this is true of all situations, but sometimes it is, where I realize it's better just to do something rather than nothing.
Yeah. And you won't regret it, right? Like in the moment you're tired and you want to quit, but you also know that if you continue, you won't regret it. So with my work, I see the hopelessness that they feel. I can feel it. I think it's coming from such a dark place that it's kind of easy to be the positive person in that interaction. Refugees will say things like, what is there to live for? I like to refocus those conversations. I usually say something like, well, the reason of this interview is for something good, something positive. It's for you and your family potentially moving to the US and you can start over. I like to tell them too that, you know, hey, my family, we were also immigrants, and I can tell you that, you know, it gets better. And so, yeah, I don't really feel doubt just because the other party's coming from such a negative place that like you have to kind of help them.
Right.
And also you need them to be in a positive state of mind to be able to testify.
Yeah.
That's part of my strategy. Like, you know, anyway, yeah. It's part of the job. Like, it makes sense why they would say things like that if you knew what happened to them.
I feel like we've touched on this a little bit all through the whole interview, but if you were to summarize why do you do what you do, what would you say?
I do what I do because God put me there. That's as concise as I can put it.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Thank you.
And so much of your journey, us talking about you being an immigrant, or not necessarily bouncing around, but going from one country into another, has equipped you for doing what you do. And the other thing I wanted to bring up too was, I love the honesty for you to say, I'm on the inside, so I see all of this. And my initial reaction was actually, immigrants are taking advantage of this. So, like, it wasn't necessarily the case that your first opinion was, these people all need help, and they, you know, the point that where you're at now, where it's just a lot of sympathy and compassion. Like, you were honest with yourself to say, as an immigrant, I don't like when other immigrants take advantage of the system.
Especially when you can actually live a comfortable enough life in your home country. Resources are limited. There are so many people that are in need. And so it's a form of injustice, or at least that's how I felt. Like, this is not right.
Right. Yeah, your ability, I think, to acknowledge the complexity and live in the tension, I assume, is so necessary for you to be able to continue doing what you do.
God gives me the strength.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you would want us to know about, God's heart for the sojourner, or how we can be active in this and do our part? Yeah, anything you wanted to add?
The main thing that I would like other people to know is that your neighbor includes the stranger, the refugee, the sojourner. It's not just your own people. And loving these people displays holiness. And as a Christian, that is what we're supposed to strive for. Holiness, Christ-likeness. And this is one way that we're called to do it.
Well said.
Thank you.
Thanks, Gabby. This conversation has been really good.
Thank you.